Welcome to Europahuset and this seminar, Rule of Law at War, where we will discuss the war crimes committed by Russia in their illegal war against Ukraine, how these are investigated and prosecuted, and how the EU and Sweden support this important work. This seminar is co-hosted between Folk och Försvar and the EU Commission's representation in Sweden. My name is Simon Jernberg, and I work as Program Manager for Global Security Trends at Folk och Försvar, and I will lead today's discussion. A warm welcome to all of you here at Europahuset, and also to all of you following us online. As a start, the Deputy Head of the EU Commission representation in Sweden, Erik von Pistolkors, would like to say a few words. Welcome.
Thank you, Simon. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Most welcome. I should be very brief because this is a very central and important issue, and I wouldn't want to eat into any of the time allotted to it by standing here and speaking for ages. Very delighted to be able to host this today. Very grateful to Simon and Folk och Försvar for helping organize. Recognize the presence of the Ukrainian ambassador. Excellency, good morning. So with those few words, let me hand back to you for the deliberations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erik. Russia's illegal war on Ukraine has been brutal, and the reports of potential war crimes have been many. The title of today's seminar, Rule of Law at War, is deliberately double in nature. The seminar will both discuss how the rule of law is working during the war in Ukraine, but also at the same time that the war is challenging rule of law at its core. In this seminar, we will discuss the architecture and the work carried out by the legal units investigating and prosecuting war crimes in Ukraine. The support of the European Union to this work will also be highlighted, especially the EU Advisory Mission Ukraine, and also EU's work on the possibility to use Russian frozen assets in funding the reconstruction of Ukraine. Sweden has played an important part in providing support to Ukraine, and we will discuss both legal assistance, how Sweden work on investigating war crimes, and how the overall Swedish support to Ukraine look like. We are honored to have such a distinguished panel and speakers at our seminar today to address these issues. We hope that this seminar will bring light on the important work that is carried out to bring justice for Ukraine, and for the continued need for us in Sweden to continue our support. As our keynote speaker, we are pleased and truly honored to have Ms. Myroslava Krasnoborova, Ukraine's Liaison Prosecutor at Eurojust. In her role at Eurojust, Ms. Krasnoborova is coordinating the war crimes and is also part of the work at Eurojust to set up the International Center for Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, the ICPA. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there has been tens of thousands of alleged war crimes reported by Ukrainian authorities. Around 100 cases are already handled at Ukrainian courts. As we will discuss later in detail, many European countries have been involved and supporting in this work. I hope that you don't mind, Ms. Krasnoborova, that I will quote you here, because I thought this quote that you were quoted by Reuters earlier this year really is at point on why we need to investigate these war crimes. This damage cannot be undone, but what we can do is to ensure that those responsible are brought to justice. It's a privilege to welcome you to Stockholm and up on our stage. Myroslava Krasnoborova, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to organizers for organizing this event, to EU representation here. It's a huge privilege for me to be here and to speak to you. And I will use this opportunity to tell you a bit how we see the architecture of criminal justice, how we are working, and what are our goals. As Simon mentioned, indeed, now in Ukraine, we have 110,000 alleged war crime registered. And this is, I would say, might be only the top of iceberg, because we never know what will happen when, and what we will discover when we will liberate the whole territory of Ukraine. And this is different type of crimes. So some of them are really grave. It's mass killing, it's tortures. Some are concerning the looting or destruction of civil infrastructure. And I would say for the first layer, the main layer, we understand that the majority of this crime has to be and will be investigated and prosecuted in Ukraine. And indeed, we have our own challenges, for example, but also we have best practices already now. So we have specialized investigators, we have specialized prosecutors, and for example, we are finding solutions for the situation, for example, when we do not have access to the territory, but then we use the modern technologies, we use, for example, 3D drone scanning to assess the territory and to see the site of the crime. And the second, but I would say that from the very beginning, when we saw the scale, it was obvious that it would be impossible only for Ukraine to deal with all these crimes on our own. And then I'm coming to the second layer, to the investigations, which are conducted also in other countries. We know so far, we know about 20 countries. It's both EU countries and non-EU countries that are conducting their own investigations. And also there are other countries that are, for example, proactively collecting evidences, who are proactively collecting testimonies of witnesses that are in their countries. The legal base for these investigations can be different. For some countries, it's universal jurisdiction, so their legislation allows to investigate any of core international crimes independently of victim or perpetrator. But for some countries, it's triggered by the citizenship. So it can be citizenship, mainly it's the citizenship of the victim, but also it can be if, for example, the perpetrator is the territory of this country. And I would say our cooperation with these countries concerning these investigations is purely driven with interests of victims and witnesses. And here I must say that the role of EU and especially Eurojust, the European Agency for Criminal Justice, was crucial. Because you can imagine, you remember those videos when dozens of thousands of people were crossing the Ukrainian border, trying to save themselves, save their children from the war. And the testimonies of these people were very important. And I remember these first days, it was difficult to predict what will happen in 1 hour, in 2 hours, in 3 hours, in a day. But what we understood very clearly that we need to preserve evidences and ensure that those who committed these crimes could be prosecuted. And I would say, I remember, it's a bit personal, I remember myself, I was sitting there in The Hague, I am liaison prosecutor for Ukraine, and I was thinking, okay, what shall I do? Should I pack my stuff and go home and help people, help my compatriots? And then I understood also that being there in The Hague, in this capital of justice, it also means something. So you can contribute in different way. And I believe it was less than a week, it was 6 days, and we had a coordination meeting at Eurojust to which we invited representatives of more than 60 countries. Generally, it was more than 60 people there, and we discussed what can we do as lawyers, as prosecutors, as investigative judges to collect evidences, to preserve evidences, and to ensure that they would be admissible for the prosecution. And it was agreed that we will establish a joint investigation team with those countries who already opened the investigation. At that moment it was Poland and Lithuania. Especially Poland, it took the majority of Ukrainian people who fled. And this has allowed us, and now it's joint investigation team, it consists of Ukraine and 6 other EU countries. And if you would recall the map, so it's the countries mainly bordering Ukraine, or also bordering Russia. So it's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovak Republic, Romania. And because this is the majority of countries who received the majority of testimonies. Of course, testimonies are different. Some people are just saying like, okay, we saw a missile, but some of them are victims of sexual violence, some of them are victims of torturing, and their testimonies, their, how to say, that what they are providing is crucial. And also, it was very important that, and I remember this, that International Criminal Court joined the JIT as well. It was for the first time in the history. And I remember these discussions, okay, because International Criminal Court, it has an independent investigation. But at the same time, with such a scale, it would be impossible even for all the resources of the court, and I know that also Sweden supports the courts very much with resources, to do the investigation on their own independently, without any kind of communication with other countries. And that's why ICC joined the JIT as a participant, not as a party, that allowed to have this special status and have their own investigation independent from the countries. And another important cornerstone of EU assistance, it was the creation of the core international crimes database. Because if you remember all these days, it was with regard, you do not know how to help to preserve the evidences if, for example, something happened. And you need to, not just to keep them on some kind of flashcard or disk, you really to ensure this, that these evidences are collected in proper way and stored proper way, and they would be admissible in any court. So would it be a national court or international court? And EU was very quick in its reaction. And already in June, the new changes to the regulation to Eurojust were into force that allowed to Eurojust to collect and to preserve evidences from different countries. And why it is important? Because as I said, all this cooperation between different countries, it is victim-driven, you know, so their interests are in the middle. And you can imagine, for example, the person fled Ukraine, went to Poland. He or she was interrogated there. Then he or she goes to Germany and then to Sweden. And in every place, he or she can be interrogated. And you will have this re-victimization again and again and again. So the whole idea of this database is to have these evidences in one place and to know that the person A was already interrogated, and not to allow that he or she goes through this process one again. So with this database, we will go from this scattered environment when we have evidences in different places, and we will analyze them, and we will have them a full picture who has what. And another very important work that was done by Eurojust, by EU, it's the coordination with the NGOs. Because I remember these first days we were approached from different people abroad, and they were asking, how can we help? What can we do? How we can contribute to the process? And in this situation, I always saying that it's important not only to help, but to ensure that it will not damage, it will not cause any kind of damage. Because people who are doing this work, they need to understand how to do this work and what they want to achieve in the end. Because of course, you can talk to person, you can interrogate it, because it's not, when NGOs are having interviews, it's not interrogation, but okay, you can talk to person, to take as an interview of the person. But then you will bring these documents to investigator, and he would say like, thank you very much, but I cannot use it as evidence because it has to be done according to the procedure. Because when I will go to the court, the judge will reject this evidence, and that's why this piece of evidence will be lost. And that's why it was very important that the genocide network, which is based at Eurojust, it had a very, very close cooperation with different NGOs, with a key role player in that field. And they also issued a guidelines together with the International Criminal Court, how to proceed, what is the best way. If you have found a victim, or if you have found a witness, what are your next actions? What you can do, what you shouldn't do, and how to achieve the best result. And when I'm speaking about ICC, and now I'm coming to this sadly, and I would say one of the most important, because you know, also it's in the beginning. I remember one of my colleagues with whom we studied together. He sent me a message, like a meme. I don't know. It was like, "Okay, you were studying international law for 5 years. Forget it. It doesn't work." And for me, it was very important to ensure that international law is working, because it's this aggression, Russian aggression, it's not about only Ukraine. It's just it's brutal and very blatant violation of all international order. Everything that we have achieved for all these years, it was just crossed, you know, in 1 second because somebody decided to do so. And I really commend to all the efforts that ICC is doing. And they were super proactive, and they responded in very swift manner. I believe our first meeting happened already on 28th, so immediately after full-scale invasion. And already on the 2nd of March, ICC opened its investigation in the situation of Ukraine. And recent arrest warrants concerning the President Putin and Lvova Belova, it's a very clear signal that you cannot hide behind these immunities. You cannot hide because you are just the president of a huge country. So the international justice is looking. International justice is important, and you really need to follow the rules. And on Ukrainian side, we are cooperating with ICC, I would say, on the ground on daily basis, because now they have their office in Ukraine. And this is really a very thorough and a very, how to say, simple but important work every day, piece by piece, piece by piece. And we are working on this principle of complementarity, because according to Rome Statute, the main burden lays on the country. And Ukraine can investigate the crimes, and ICC steps only when we have this limitation, for example, as I said, about the immunities. And so ICC has its competence in Ukraine concerning, as you know, maybe 3 types of crimes. So it's war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And then we have another crime, and it's the crime of aggression. And I know that you've heard a lot about aggressions, that this is why it's so important to prosecute it, because this is a mother of all crimes. If not aggressions, there would be no war crimes, there won't be crimes against humanity, no genocide. But I would like to use this opportunity and to ask you to look at it also from another angle. You know, when we are speaking about the crime of genocide, we also see it and the prosecution of crime of aggression. We also see it as a possibility to bring to responsibility those who is responsible for the deaths of Ukrainian soldiers. Because if you would imagine those people who are fighting now in Ukrainian army, they majority of them, they were not military themselves. So they were IT guys, they were teachers, they were working on the, I don't know, some pharmacy fabric, they were prosecutors, we have prosecutors who are fighting, and they never ever in their life expected that they would have to fight for their country, for the independence of their country. And if you would look at law, very cynically look at that law, so if he or she was killed in the battle, it's not a war crime. It's not a crime against humanity. And then you are looking around, so these people are dying just legally? Is it possible? No, it's not possible. And that's why the responsibility for the crime of aggression is very important, because this is something those who started this aggression is responsible for the deaths of all these people. And you know, there are a lot of discussions about tribunal, how it will be format, etc. But for us as the prosecutors, it was obvious and that we need to act already. We need to collect, to preserve, to analyze and to build the case of aggression, not to lose evidences. Because evidences for the crime of aggression, it's a lot of OSINT. And what is OSINT data? Today you have it. If you didn't fix it, tomorrow it can be already cleaned all over the internet. And that's why, so within these discussions, we decided to establish this International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression. And the whole idea is to collect the evidences, to analyze them, and to build the case that would be admissible in any court. So it can be tribunal, it can be national jurisdictions, or I know that there are some discussions about the extending of jurisdiction of ICC. So our main task there, of my colleagues who are working now in The Hague, and also their partners from JIT countries and also US is contributing, is to collect everything, to look, to analyze what we have, what we're missing. And all this should be really, I'm always telling to them, like, it should be bulletproof, you know, because this case would be really looked under the microscope, and you need to be very careful what you are doing and to do it very, very thoroughly. And I hope we still have a few minutes. And if I might just maybe bring your attention to the certain type of crimes that are not on the surface, you know, so you know all about tortures, killings, shellings of civil infrastructure. But for example, I want to tell you about the civilian detainees. So you've heard about children that were illegally transferred and moved on temporary occupied territories or to Russia, but there is a category of civil detainees. This is adults, but they are kept in the detention centers all over the occupied territories and Russia, and this is people who are detained without any kind of legal reasons or under some sham reasons, and they even do not have a chance to be exchanged. You know, for example, for military, there is always the chance to return. But for those people, we do not know what happens with them. We don't know how many of them. And if we say that people, that adults, parents in Ukraine are waiting for their children who are illegally kept in Russia, but children in Ukraine are waiting for their parents who are civil detainees. And another crime, it's environmental crime. You know, living also in The Hague and here in Sweden, I see, you know, how carefully we are about environment. We separate everything, the litter, but every time my heart comes apart when I see the results of every strike. You saw the results of the Kakhovka Dam destruction, you know, it's something that the unique pieces of nature are destroyed and we will never see them again. And last but not least, and this is something that we didn't think before, but it's also very important, it's the crimes against cultural heritage. You know, it's we always say that these cultural objects, they are also silent victims of the war. And it's not only about destruction, physical destruction of the historical monuments, but it's about looting. So, for example, I remember I was talking to the prosecutor from Kherson region, and he said that 80% of objects of Kherson Historical Museum are not there anymore. So this is also something targeted the Ukrainian identity. And yeah, so this is something that I also wanted to share with you, that please take care, be aware of these crimes as well. Thank you very much. I would say that this is all from my side, and I'm ready to respond to any questions.
Thank you so much for, yes, thank you. Thank you so much for lifting the architecture and how you work and the coordination, but also at the end here that there are so many type of crimes that needs to be investigated. I have a few questions, and you will also come back for a Q&A at the end. But I would like you to maybe talk a little bit more about the first layer, as you called it, the work in Ukraine. On the ground, how does the collaboration and cooperation between various agencies and actors look like there?
Yes, thank you for your question. And I would say that, unfortunately, we had our experience of 2014, when we had completely no knowledge how to proceed with the war crimes, and sometimes people were really mixing, war crimes and military crimes. But now we are working, there are several authorities that are involved. So the investigative authority, it's the Security Service of Ukraine and National Police of Ukraine, and prosecutors is also in every case. And what they have now, and what really showed its efficiency, that they have these mobile groups, which consist of the investigator, of prosecutor, of the expert. So if something happens, they go all together and they see all this complex scheme. And what may be also important to mention, for example, we have now the specialization, something that we also deem as necessary, for example, for sexual violence crimes. Because to tackle this type of crimes, you really need to have a very sensitive approach. Because you know that not everybody are ready to share their pain, to share what happened. And it's not only women, it's also men, it's also children, and to every person you need to have a special approach, and that's why we have this special unit within the Prosecutor General's office that is dealing purely with conflict-related sexual violence. And also we have a huge, on the side of, we have this local mobile groups, we have specialized groups, and we have the big specialized unit in the Prosecutor General's office. We call it, it has a long name, but we call it War Department. So they are dealing with this huge magistral case of aggression.
Thank you. And you were touching upon it, the crime of aggression, and this the Center for Prosecutions you're setting up and the work that you're doing. In your opinion, what is the probability that the crime of aggression could be brought to court?
I'm sure it will be brought to court. I don't want to speculate about political developments, what kind of tribunal will be established, but anyway, even now there are possibilities, and in Ukraine we have the crime of aggression in our criminal court, so we can bring the case to the Ukrainian court as well, but we have this restriction, we have these immunities for the Troika. And that's why, the main task of ICPA is to build the case that would be admissible, and then we will see, first we will have the case, and if politicians will tell us that there is a tribunal where we can send this case, it will be sent to tribunal, or we will see to which jurisdiction it can go, because it can go not only to Ukrainian jurisdiction, but also to the other countries which have universal jurisdiction. So we will see.
Okay, Thank you so much,
Thank
Ms.
you.
Krasnoborova, and you will be back on stage
Thank you.
in a while. Thank you. With that, we will move on in our program and focus on the support that the European Union has provided Ukraine in investigating war crimes. Up until December 2022, the Swedish diplomat Fredrik Westlau was the deputy head of the EU advisory mission Ukraine. The mission did, among other things, support Ukraine in law enforcement agencies in gathering evidence and preparing cases of war crimes committed in Ukraine. We're pleased to have Mr. Westlau here with us today to give some insights to this work and reflections on the civil society's role in ensuring accountability. After his mission in Ukraine, Mr. Westlau has continued his engagement as chairman of the Reckoning Project, an initiative to train Ukrainian journalists and researchers to gather evidence of war crimes. I leave it to you, Fredrik.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Yes, I believe so. Thank you very much, Simon, for that introduction. I think Miroslava really covered the whole spectrum, so I will try to add what I can when it comes to this extremely important topic. Both Simon and Miroslava mentioned this absolutely staggering number of over 110,000 registered war crimes. The Ukrainian Office of the Prosecutor General on its website every day updates this number, and every day it increases by by a few hundred. And as Miroslava said, I mean, this is only the tip of the iceberg because it doesn't really account for the crimes that are being committed on the occupied territories of Ukraine. And this is 20% of Ukraine, which is currently under occupation. But what sort of crimes do we talk about when we talk about war crimes? I think it's quite important to sort of dwell on this. I mean, the bulk of these crimes are not the result of negligence or, the rogue soldier or random acts. But I think it's important to understand that these crimes are highly deliberate. They constitute state policy by the Russian Federation. So they're really intrinsic features of how Russia is fighting its war of aggression against Ukraine, and also very intimately linked to its military and political objectives in Ukraine. And let me give you a few examples of this. I mean, first of all, as also Miroslava mentioned, you have the deportation and indoctrination of Ukrainian children. So the government of Ukraine has, up until today, registered around 20,000 cases of children, Ukrainian children, being deported to the Russian Federation. There, they often go through filtration camps. Many of them are adopted by Russian families, even though their parents are Ukrainians and are still alive. And I mean, this is a very deliberate effort by the Russian Federation to really erase their identity as Ukrainians and make them Russians, to Russify them. And this is also part of Russia's effort to, in a sense, eradicate Ukrainian culture and ultimately also eradicate the Ukrainian nation. So far, Ukraine has managed to return around 400 of these 20,000 children. And also in the occupied territories, you see how these children are being re-indoctrinated or indoctrinated in schools, for instance. Language has shifted from Ukrainian to Russian. And they're no longer taught about Ukrainian culture, history, identity, but they're taught about Russian identity and culture, all in an effort to sort of Russify them. Secondly, also in the occupied territories, I mean, we've seen cases of torture, of summary executions, of sexual violence, of disappearances. And this is also a very deliberate state strategy by the Russian Federation to terrorize the population living there, to break the resistance in a way. And I think it's clear, if we look at this, it's widespread, it's very systematic. We see clear patterns here as well. And I want to quote the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, who visited Ukraine in September. And she reported the following, and I'll quote this because I think it's important to actually take note of this. And she's talking about torture in occupied territories. These grievous acts appear neither random nor incidental, but rather orchestrated as part of a state policy to intimidate, to instill fear, to punish, or to extract information and confessions. So this really goes to the heart of these crimes being state policy by the Russian Federation. Also, another example is the campaign which started last year in October, the missile and drone campaign against the critical infrastructure in Ukraine, and primarily trying to hit the energy infrastructure. And this was also a very deliberate attempt to make Ukraine uninhabitable over the winter in order to cause another wave of refugees into the EU, to put pressure on the EU, to sort of split the EU and undermine the EU support for Ukraine. So I think these three examples sort of point to, again, how these crimes that we see in Ukraine are very deliberate. Again, they're not it's not a question of negligence on the side of Russia, but they're very deliberate part of state policy. So what is the EU doing to support accountability in Ukraine? And I'll point at sort of 5 big areas. I think first of all, you have support for the International Criminal Court, and Miroslava spoke about this, of course. And this is, of course, extremely important. I mean, you know, the ICC is sort of the main investigating body, international investigating body in Ukraine. They've set up the largest presence outside of The Hague in Ukraine ever. So the ICC office in Kiev is the largest ICC presence outside of The Hague. And it's working, like Miroslava said, on a day-to-day basis with Ukrainian prosecution to take these cases forward. I think, you know, it's no surprise that the EU is supporting the ICC. I mean, the EU is an institution that is fundamentally built on the rule of law. This is reflected in how the EU works internally, but it's also reflected in the EU's external relations. And so it's dearly part of the EU's DNA, in a sense, to support efforts of the ICC. And I think, you know, this has already borne fruit. If you take the arrest warrants of Putin and also Lvova Belova for the deportation of children, this is quite remarkable. And I mean, I think we can expect that the ICC will be issuing more arrest warrants in the months to come as well. But I think the big challenge here, of course, for the ICC is that it doesn't have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. It has jurisdiction over war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, but not the crime of aggression. I'll also return to this a little bit later when talking about the special tribunal. Then secondly, of course, you have individual EU member states that are carrying out investigations. I think there are around 14 states now in the EU doing this. Sweden is one of them, carrying out a structural investigation. I think we may hear more about this later on. But it's not only states in the EU. We also have other states outside the EU carrying out investigations. And I think this is extremely important because it's important to make sure that accountability efforts in Ukraine is not only a Western undertaking, but it should be a global, international undertaking. I mean, you have the ICC, which is a global body with 123 state parties. But if you have other states outside the EU, outside the West, also investigating war crimes in Ukraine, this adds to the legitimacy of these efforts. Thirdly, the EU is also part of something which is called the Atrocities Crimes Advisory Group. And this is an organization inside Ukraine, based primarily in Kiev. And it consists of the EU, the US, the UK, and other actors, including civil society groups. The EU Advisory Mission, which I used to work for, is part of ACA, as it's called, Atrocities Crimes Advisory Group. And this is really the main international support structure for Ukrainian law enforcement agencies and also the Ukrainian prosecution. And it consists of international prosecutors, investigators, judges, experts on gender and sexual-based violence, who work hand in hand supporting Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, both collect evidence but also prepare these cases. It works at the strategic level, so the ACA has helped the Ukrainian prosecution develop a prosecutorial strategy on how to deal with the vast number of cases. But it also does more operational work, like case file reviews, for instance, going through cases and advising Ukrainian prosecutors on how best to take them forward. It also has, as part of its structure, so-called mobile justice teams, which are very rapid response teams of international experts that can go to a crime scene. Let's say there's been a missile strike in Odessa, then they can travel there in the same day and support the local prosecutors and investigators with collecting evidence and also sort of conceptualizing the sort of crime we're talking about. Then fourthly, the EU also supports efforts to set up a tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. I mean, this has been mentioned before. I think the big challenge, of course, is that the ICC does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, but the crime of aggression is really, as Miroslava said, sort of the mother of all crimes here in this context. And if this crime is not investigated, not prosecuted, then this crime becomes completely hollow, meaningless in a sense, because this is such a blatant prima facie case of aggression. I think in the collective West, I mean, you have this core group, as it's called, working with the Ukrainians on the tribunal for the crime of aggression. And I think currently has maybe 30, 40 members, Europeans, the US, Canada, some non-Western members as well. And they're discussing how best to set this up. So I think there's quite strong support to establish a tribunal, but there's still sort of outstanding questions on how best to do this and how best to ensure that the tribunal can overcome this challenge of immunities for the Troika, for the president, the prime minister, and also the foreign minister of the Russian Federation. I'm pretty certain that a tribunal will be set up at some point, given the sort of the political support for this. And also the ICPA, which is working within Eurojust, is really working towards this, doing a lot of the practical work already now, the preparatory work in terms of developing legal briefs, looking at, working on indictments essentially for this. But then it will need, a tribunal with jurisdiction to hand this over to as well at some point in the future. And then fifthly, and finally, I would say that the EU also has an important role in terms of supporting civil society. I think what we've seen here with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is that civil society has become extremely involved on accountability issues. As Simon mentioned, I'm the chairman of the board of the Reckoning Project, which was an initiative launched at the start of the invasion by journalists and lawyers. And the idea is really to train Ukrainian journalists and researchers to collect evidence of war crimes, because they're often the ones who go to the scene first and meet with victims and witnesses. But they should be able to collect this evidence in a way which makes it admissible later in court. And so these testimonies that the Reckoning Project has collected are then used in articles and documentaries, especially in the global south, to really highlight the sort of crimes that are being committed in Ukraine. But the evidence, the testimonies, are also used in a legal sense as well. So, for instance, the Reckoning Project provided a so-called Article 15 submission to the ICC on the deportation of children. And also, the Reckoning Project journalists were the first to report, actually, that Russia was deporting Ukrainian children. So you have organizations like the Reckoning Project, many other NGOs that work on both gathering evidence and supporting Ukrainian law enforcement. But the big challenge, I think, in this war is that this is probably the best documented war ever in history. I mean, the challenge is not that there's not enough evidence, but nearly that there's too much. I mean, there's so much evidence to go through, to systematize, to gather, to process, to secure in a way. So this will be work that will take many, many years. So let me conclude by saying that, I mean, the EU considers that accountability for war crimes in Ukraine is really integral to the overall approach that the EU has to Ukraine and to its support for Ukraine. These efforts are really quite extensive and comprehensive, but if you look at the scale, this is really needed because this is absolutely vast number of crimes that we're talking about. And again, I mean, there is this accountability gap when it comes to the crime of aggression because there is no tribunal, there is no court that really has effective jurisdiction over aggression. And this work will take years, if not decades. And I think just my final point is quite, I want to illustrate a little bit. If you look at the crimes committed by Nazis in the Second World War, it took 70, 80 years. 80 years later, perpetrators were still being tried for this. So I can very well imagine that something similar will happen in this case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fredrik. I think we have time for one short follow-up question. You picture a very bright picture of how the European support looks like, but there has been voices raised of fear that the support from the European countries and the EU might be fading. What's your take on that and your understanding?
I don't think so. I mean, this notion of Ukraine fatigue, I don't really buy it. And the reason I say this is because I think there's a very strong sense in Europe, in the EU, in member states, in Brussels, that Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is such a fundamental challenge to Europe, to European security, to European values and principles. So I think our leaders understand the gravity of this and are committed to supporting Ukraine. So I don't think that's a big problem.
Great. Thank you, Fredrik Westlau.
Thank you.
You will also be back for the Q&A. We will move on to a panel of Swedish experts to discuss the topics of the Swedish support and also a little bit of the European support for Ukraine. We have Hanna Lemoine, Deputy Chief Prosecutor at the Swedish Prosecution Authority. We have Elsa Håstad, Ambassador and working at the Secretariat for the Recovery and Development of Ukraine at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And Anders Arnlid, Director General at the Swedish Chamber of Commerce. Welcome. And I've asked you all, we can Hanna here and Elsa, yes, good. I've asked you to give a short presentation from your view on the support. And we'll start with you, Hanna Lemoine. You represent the Swedish Prosecution Authority. And in the discussions we've had before this seminar, you mentioned a lot of ways in which you have supported Ukraine, but also international legal authorities, but also how you work on war crimes from a Swedish angle, has been touched upon earlier, but also some of the experience from the war in Syria. So please present.
Thank you. And first of all, let me just say how impressed I am by my Ukrainian peers, the work that they have done, how effective they've been in setting up a system and having specialized investigators and prosecutors working on war crimes, which I find, as with my experience, is key to success to be able to prosecute these types of crimes. And since Miroslava got a bit personal, let me do that as well. The day of the invasion, I was in The Hague at Eurojust for a coordination meeting regarding a war crime in a different region. And there's a few things that, or very few things that gets under your skin as a war crimes prosecutor. You've seen and heard a lot. But this, I thought this was something that really shook me, knowing that peers, prosecutor peers in Europe were facing a war. And of course, knowing that as a war crime prosecutor, you can in some way assist because there's finally no peace without justice. I think that is something that has helped me and my colleagues at the war crimes team in the Swedish Prosecution Authority. I will come back to the investigative measures that we have taken in relation to Ukraine, but let me just first go back a little bit and tell you a bit about the war crimes team in Sweden, the prosecution team and the team within the police, just to give you an understanding why I think we were quite quick in opening one investigation regarding the Ukraine situation. So Miroslava mentioned that different countries work on different legal bases for investigating war crimes. In Sweden, we use the universal jurisdiction tool, and from a decision from the Supreme Court last year, we know also that we need some sort of connection to Sweden to open an investigation and eventually put a case to trial. But of course, just the fact that these crimes are some of the most horrendous crimes that the society knows about, even that is one thing to consider when we decide whether or not to open a case. The first core international crime case that Sweden dealt with, which led to a trial, regarded former Yugoslavia, and that was tried in court 2007-2008, and or 2006 and 2007. And after that, 2008, it was decided that we need specialized prosecutors in Sweden for this. It's complicated to investigate these types of crimes. I think you all know about that. I will not dwell upon that. But it's important, and since a few years, or quite many years, we have a specialized team. To date, there's 8 prosecutors working full-time in Sweden with crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. We cooperate with a unit within the police, which also is specialized, and we have a good cooperation with the Swedish Migration Agency, and we have good cooperations with many peers in Europe and beyond, especially through the Genocide Network, which also Miroslava mentioned, where peers meet at least twice a year to discuss these issues. So, coming back to Syria, which Simon mentioned, Sweden was the first country who had a trial regarding war crimes committed in Syria. I was a part of that team that was the prosecutors in that case, and that was in 2015 the case started in trial. That case regarded an opposition fighter who was convicted in the end for war crimes. And Sweden was quite criticized. Why do we investigate and put to trial an opposition fighter when the regime is so much worse? And as a prosecutor, as a lawyer, it's evident, we follow evidence. If we see a crime and we can prosecute that, that's what we will do. But it also made us think that if we want to go further and not just act on low-level perpetrators, maybe looking at what the Syrian regime is doing, we need to work on a structure. We need to pull a base and then work the way forward. And that's when we decided back in 2015 to open a broader investigation to build these structures, to see who's actually responsible for the crimes committed on a higher level. This investigation that we opened in Syria has continued, and I know that other countries are doing similar things. And through the work in the Swedish investigation, we could, for example, assist our German peers in their investigation that led to the Koblenz trial. The Koblenz trial where the first higher-level Syrian regime person was convicted for torture, war crimes in Syria. So this is how we also see it. The evidence is shattered all over the world. It might not lead to a trial in Sweden, but maybe at the ICC or at Germany or in Ukraine. And we have a similar investigation that was opened later regarding the ISIL crimes, which have then led to convictions also in Sweden. So with this experience, not long after the invasion of Ukraine, we decided, just a couple of weeks after, to open a similar investigation regarding the situation in Ukraine, since we saw and we understood there will be evidence in Sweden, coming to Sweden, fleeing to Sweden, and we need to be there to make sure that we can assist in building the structure to find who's responsible, and of course there are many people that are responsible for the crimes that are committed. And especially, as Miroslava mentioned, sexual violence is something that is extremely important to, in an early phase, not sometimes always too early, because sometimes the victims are so traumatized they don't want to speak immediately. But it's important for them to know that we are here willing to take their testimony when they are ready. So that's why we opened this investigation, and we have collected evidence, which of course we see can be, if not used in a Swedish trial, but there's no statute of limitation, as was mentioned by Fredrik. These cases take a long time. We have prosecuted people from Rwanda 20 years after the genocide. So there will be one day when there is just justice and evidence will be used. And if not used in Sweden, as I said, this evidence might be used at ICC or another country. And of course, we also contribute with what we do here in Sweden to the SISED, the database that the Eurojust has opened up to collect evidence just like these. We also participated through the Genocide Network in the guidelines set up for the NGOs, because we know that it's so important that the first interviews that are taken, the testimonies are done in a good way, so that it doesn't harm the future trials, even though also knowing that it's extremely important that the NGOs find these witnesses, which maybe not the authorities can find. It was mentioned that the EUAM Ukraine, where also Swedish prosecutors have been working, and we have also seconded to ICC. ICC was requesting assistance after they opened the case regarding Ukraine, and we have, after that, contributed with 3 prosecutors working on secondment at the ICC. In last year, we also held a couple of trainings for prosecutors in Ukraine and the bordering countries, since we see that we have good experience of working on war crimes. We wanted to share this at least we thought there's at least something we can do. So we initiated through the Genocide Network and the EGTN, which is a European training academy, that we should, together with our peers in France, Germany, the Netherlands, assist in holding webinars on this issue. And we held a few webinars regarding this last autumn. And I hope that that is also something that has helped not only Ukrainian prosecutors, but also prosecutors in the neighboring countries, which not have had as many experience as we've had with war crimes. So that is in brief what we have done. This is, of course, a continuous project, and as I see it, there's no statute of limitation, and this is something that is extremely important to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Elsa Håstad, you represent the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Sweden's support to Ukraine. So please, could you tell us little bit about Sweden is doing for Ukraine right now, how and why it is still important?
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. When I was 29 years old and we had long left Soviet Union behind us, I was one of the first desk officers for Ukraine. My task was to build up the first bilateral program between Sweden and Ukraine and creating the first support. This was 1999, another time, another setting, and another vision for the Swedish support and the cooperation with Ukraine. In one way, we can say the goal was the same. It was about supporting a free and democratic Ukraine. But today, 25 years later, I once again find myself working with Ukraine, close at heart. My grandfather was born in Ukraine. And once again, I work with Ukraine, but the time has changed, the setting has changed, and to our help, we use the long-term commitment of 25 years. And this becomes one of our most precious assets for Sweden when we continue the support with Ukraine, because we have been with you for a long time. We've believed in you, we've been standing side by side with you, and our financial and political commitment is a proof of the never-wavering support for Ukraine that Sweden had. And this support that we started so long time ago has created all the contacts and all the credibility that we need today when we increase, scale up, and change the support. And for reasons that we all know, we are more engaged today than ever before. The support for Ukraine, when it comes to finances, projects, cooperations, it's also our muscles behind the political dialogue, behind our political vision, behind the political commitments that we do, because it's not only talk about democracy, it's not only talk about peace, EU accession, green transition, cultural heritage. No, it's actually real cooperation. And today it's not only about EU accession, although we are very happy for the decision that happened the day before yesterday. And we talk about the EU accession as the biggest peace project of them all. But today it's also about justice, and it's also about a rule-based world. For Sweden, this is about our own existence. For Sweden, this is crucial. For Sweden, this needs to take time because we know it will take time, but there are no other options. And all of us know what is happening in Ukraine. We talked about it today. We know, reading all the numerous reports telling us about Russia subjecting Ukrainian civilians to extrajudicial killings, torture, enforced disappearance, sexual violence, and the illegal deport of children to Russia and Belarus that all of you spoke about. As you said, Miroslava, we have international order at stake. And we are acting. Sweden is acting. Everything you talked about today is also Swedish engagement and commitment. Because we know that justice must be served for the victims and rule of law must be restored. It is important for Sweden. So we are engaged more than ever. And as I said, it is on the political level, but it's also on all levels of society. And we see a mobilization, manifestation of support that we have not seen before. And Sweden is fully engaged to claim accountability for international crimes committed. And we are at the same time engaged in reforms for the macro-financial stability being negotiated in Brussels, Ukraine facility, it's our joint support, and we're at the same time committed for the EU accession reforms and humanitarian assistance. Just a few examples. Many of you mentioned the civil society, and some of you might know that this summer we adopted the biggest, the most comprehensive foreign aid strategy to a single country ever. And it is about the EU integration, but it's also about rule of law. That is one of the key priority. And there we have the civil society. And Fredrik, you mentioned the important role that civil society is playing, and so did you, Miroslava. And we are so extremely proud that Sweden is actually supporting the key civil society organizations, because the work they are doing is extremely important. We also work with the UN family. We work with reconciliation projects in 18 local communities. We support independent media to do independent reporting, to help with the accountability, increased transparency, and we support the ICC. And what we did in the beginning was that together with 40 other states, we started with investigating the violations in Ukraine immediately in March 2022. This is also part of the Swedish support. And Hanna, you mentioned the secondments. We also second through Swedish police authority. So we contribute to the work on ground. And Fredrik, you talked about the tribunal that we are also participating in. So I would say that we have mobilized support on all levels. It's on EU level, we support and the Eurojust, the database mentioned by Miroslava, the EU advisory missions helping on the ground, supporting Ukrainian authorities, working with the mobile teams. So we are there as well. We also, of course, work on the UN level, both in Ukraine through the development cooperation, but also on a UN level. And we have also contributed to the establishment of a commission of inquiry together with the UN Human Rights Council, documenting war crimes committed by the Russian authorities and armed forces. We also support the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. So, as you can hear, we are committed on all levels. And I think this is extremely important for us to be both on the political level, on the expert level, on the multilateral level, bilaterally, and also through the private sector. Anders, you know more about this, but we also have a business community in Sweden just waiting to expand in Ukraine, because that is also a way of mobilizing support and also supporting Ukraine. So, can we say that our support has shifted after February 2022? Well, shifted in one way, but I would also say added on. As I said in the beginning, the support and cooperation goes back 25 years. But of course, we do more today, economically, politically, militarily. We are one of the biggest development partners, one of the biggest supporters, and in total, we have provided more than $2.5 billion since the Russia's full-scale invasion. So if we take what we had between the 90s and 2021, so before the war, the support was also substantial. It was $3.7 million. So today, after February 2022, it's 2.5 billion. So as you hear, it's a huge increase. So apart from justice reforms, economic development, reconstruction, we also have military support that is extensive. And Ukraine, as you know, also reading in the media, have received some of our most advanced weapons systems. We also have discussions with Ukraine on the long-term security commitments in line with G7 declarations of giving security commitments. This is also an ongoing process together with the Ukraine peace plan, and Sweden has decided to be co-leader when it comes to nuclear safety together with Czech colleagues and French colleagues. So before I end, I also want to say that it is with great unity within the European Union family that we actually move forward towards justice. And in the middle of an ongoing war, Sweden is working in parallel with both reconstruction and preparing for justice to come. And we know from other countries that justice takes time, mentioned by all of you, Rwanda, Darfur, Second World War, 70 to 80 years. We know it takes time. Some actually say that it's a waste of time, it's window dressing. Of course it's not, because one day, sooner or later, we know that justice will be served and there are no other options for us. So Sweden will continue with the main tasks, is to help Ukraine win the war, to help Ukraine win the peace and to get justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least, Anders Ahnlid. During the Swedish presidency of the European Union, you led a group that investigated if and how Russian frozen assets could be used to finance the reconstruction of Ukraine. And you're also the Director General of the Swedish Chamber of Commerce.
The National Board of Trade.
National Board of Trade, sorry, good. So you have two hats here, but please tell us a little bit about your work.
Thank you very much, Simon, and I am delighted to be able to be given this opportunity to talk about the work on frozen Russian assets for the support of Ukraine. It's an important issue, I think. I will try to cut a long and complicated story as short and straightforward as possible. And I'm also glad to have such an august, qualified audience and qualified participants here that know more about this subject than myself in many respects. Because here we are talking about an issue where we see that rule of law and the fact that we have a European Union, our European Union, under the rule of law, is actually putting limitations on legitimate quests for support to Ukraine, as you will soon hear. Early on, after the 24th of February last year, as you know, the European Union decided to freeze or immobilize substantial Russian assets. Morally speaking, it is, I guess, a no-brainer that the aggressor, the brutal Russian war machine, the responsible Russians should be held accountable and should, of course, pay for the enormous destruction, material destruction caused in Ukraine, in addition to the human suffering and the death of innocent civilian and other Ukraine citizens. So early on, after the freezing of these assets, European leaders started to look at possibilities to use these assets for support for Ukraine's reconstruction. In May last year, the 27 heads of state and government at their European Council meeting decided that work should start to this effect. In December last year, the European Commission did put forward ideas on how it could be done. In February of this year, the 27 heads of state and government in our European Union decided that this work should be stepped up. Now, that led the then Swedish presidency of the European Union to install an ad hoc working party on the use of frozen and immobilized assets to support Ukraine's reconstruction. That was the formal name of the ad hoc working party. And I was asked to chair that working party, which had on its plate issues that basically were new and that had not been worked upon earlier in our European Union. So it was kind of groundbreaking work that should be done in this group. Why an ad hoc group? Because it did span, it has a 2-year mandate over a number of council configurations in our European Union. We were mandated to look at political foreign policy issues, economic issues, financial issues, and legal issues in this group. 2-year mandate. It's now Spain that is chairing the group, which still meets. I chaired 7 meetings during our presidency. And a key provision in the mandate of the group is that any proposals coming out of it should be in accordance with EU law and in accordance with international law. We were also mandated to look at possibilities how to cooperate with partners outside the EU, mainly the G7 countries. When we started, there were no officially kind of certified information about the size of these assets and where they were. New regulations were decided upon in the 10th sanctions package in February that led to EU member states being obliged to report about these assets. And in May, we knew that there are more than 200 billion euros of Russian central bank's assets sitting in a handful of EU countries, most of it in Belgium in a institution called Euroclear, but also in Luxembourg and some other European countries. And we were also informed that there were more than 20 billion euros of private Russian assets, the oligarch yachts, real estates and what have you. But the bulk of the assets were the official state-owned assets of Russia. And the work in the Working Party concentrated, for natural reasons, on these state official assets, the more than 200 billion central bank assets. And we had lengthy discussions about this, looking at what EU rules and regulations and law on ownership told us, looking at what international law told us about state immunity. And after discussions on this, one idea came forward, which we found in the group was worthwhile exploring. And that was, since state immunity, as interpreted, I think, by all EU member states, made it impossible to touch the original assets and the lawful gains from the assets. If they were put in bonds, bonds mature and expires, and the yield, the lawful yield from these original assets should still be Russian. But now these assets were frozen, and since bonds expire and the financial instruments mature and expire, and yields are put on accounts in these financial institutions, they still tick interest. So beyond the legally kind of claimed, the contractual rights of Russia, there are additional windfall gains from these assets. And the idea in the group that we had was to make sure that these windfall contribution at least should, as soon as possible, be used for Ukraine's reconstruction. You could say that these are small amounts compared to the needs. The needs are enormous, as we know, but this would still yield between 2 and 4 billion euros per year. So it's not it's sizable. It's important. We thought in the group, and I was mandated by my government to push for this idea, that it should be possible to have formal proposals to this effect coming from the Commission. And as you might have seen, Ursula von der Leyen actually promised that such a proposal should be put forward before the summer break at that time. I left the presidency 30th of June, but we had an interesting development at the end of the Swedish presidency, in that while large EU member states were still insisting or questioning whether this was in accordance with state immunity, the European Central Bank also entered the picture, and Madame Lagarde and her staff argued that even this step that we were pondering could inflict on financial stability and on the status of the euro as a reserve currency. And therefore, there was a need for new discussions. No proposal came from von der Leyen and the Commission before the summer break. The matter has been additionally discussed, and some progress, I think, is now being made. And as you might have observed at the October European Council meeting, the 27 heads of state and government agreed again that decisive process, and now I quote, decisive progress is needed in coordination with partners on how any extraordinary revenues held by private entities stemming directly from Russia's immobilized assets could be directed to support Ukraine and its recovery and reconstruction consistent with applicable contractual obligations and in accordance with EU and international law. The European Council calls on the High Representative and the Commission to accelerate work with a view of submitting proposals. So that's where we stand now. And I think personally that it is still a short-term possibility that should be followed and should be seized upon. We talked in the group about short-term measures and long-term measures, but because we know that this will not be sufficient, and we know that there are wider needs. And in that context, I would like to finish by making two additional comments. One is that we, of course, in the group agreed with what the G7 group already decided in Japan last spring, and the EU is of course part of this, that these immobilized central bank assets should be held immobilized until Russia pays for what it owns Ukraine in terms of reconstruction. That's one important point. And my final point is, to end where I started, that the perceived limitations that we have been operating under, and there are limitations, are of course also questioned by lawyers and people who are much better versed than me to talk about international law. And there is a debate on this, both in Europe and in the United States. I think maybe most vocally pursued by Bob Zoellick, Larry Summers, and Philip Zelikow in the US, well-known people that argue that under the rules and regulations for countermeasures, it should be possible to interpret international law in a way that make it possible not only to use these windfall gains following from these huge assets, but also use the assets themselves. But that's another story and another debate that we could not handle in the working party that I chaired. Nevertheless, key to state, and I hope that during the Spanish presidency there will be additional progress to use at least these 2 to 4 billion euros per year for Ukraine's reconstruction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And in the interest of time, I would like to ask our earlier speakers to join us on stage again for some questions from the audience. Please state your name and indicate if the question is for a particular speaker or in general.
You have to be sorry.
Yep. And do also keep the questions short. Yes, I saw one hand here and one over there, so the microphone is coming.
Is it on? Yeah. My name is Joakim Persson. I'm from FOI, the Swedish Defense Research Agency. I have a question for the legal expertise. My focus obviously is how to defeat our criminal enemies, who, while they don't care about law themselves, are still prepared to use law as a weapon of war against us and our allies. Like, for example, Hamas is deploying their troops among the civilian population or under the civilian population, are hindering the civilian evacuation, and I would like to ask the legal expertise how we are supposed to defeat these enemies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we'll take the question over here as well.
Thank you. Ruth Brown from the Swedish Police Authority. I have a question for the prosecutors. You've touched a lot on identifying victims and collecting evidence. I could wonder whether you could say a few words about the work of identifying the perpetrators. Thank you.
Okay, so I understood it as questions for maybe Miroslava. And
yep. Yes, indeed. There is, as you can imagine, as a policeman, it's a huge work done, and it's a very challenging one, because most of the perpetrators are acting militaries of Russian Federation, and a huge amount of work has to be done with the OSINT data, because I would say, okay, OSINT data and intelligence, and this is something that we are our main sources that we are looking. Of course, from time to time, we also managing to find the information when we are, for example, when we had counteroffensive last year and the Russians were leaving their positions in a rush. It also gave us a huge bulk of evidences that we can now use in our proceedings. But I would say that for looking for the perpetrators, the main sources are OSINT and, of course, intelligence.
Thank you. Hanna, would you maybe like to add something to that question. Yes.
Sure. In Sweden, of course, we cannot try anyone in absentia, which you can in other countries. But the idea about having a broader scope of an investigation is exactly that, to build the structures to identify who's the suspect. And also not on the just lower level, but also higher up in the hierarchy. And quite often when you interview, when you have identified a victim or a witness, that person can tell you about the crime base, sort of, the crime that has been committed. But quite often you can also draw conclusions on who is the perpetrator in that regard. But another very important form of evidence that looking for perpetrators is people have more structural information, like, for example, journalists who can have an overview. But then again, it's quite often regarding open source investigations, digital evidence that's left behind. And if you talk about the Swedish focus, of course, then we're limited to the evidence that's available in Sweden. But that's also doing one part of the job. Thank you.
Thank you. And who would like to answer the question of how to act if the enemy is not following the laws themselves?
As a prosecutor, I don't go in and comment on issues where I don't have a case. So I'm reluctant to do that. To me, just the main importance is something that we already touched upon. The idea on following and respecting the laws of war is important, that we do investigate and prosecute when we have evidence to show that this is reality, this is what needs to be followed. That's the only thing as a prosecutor and a practitioner I can say on that. Thank you.
Anyone else wants to comment on that question? No? Otherwise, we had a question here at the front row, and I saw a hand there.
Thank you. I'm Hans Corell, former legal counsel of the United Nations. Let me first thank all of you for very professional and precise presentation. I was really impressed to listen to you all. I have one question, which I will put to Anders Arnold, but I would just say that this afternoon I will have a regular meeting with David Crane and Irving Kotler. The three of us have made a proposal for a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. And this is now discussed in the General Assembly. But I'd understand from listening to the Minister of Foreign Affairs yesterday in a meeting that the issue has been somewhat stuck there. But my question to Anders is that I understand from my contacts in Canada that they have already adopted legislation to address the question that you presented. Are you aware of this, and how do you view this in your sort of Canadian European context? Thank you.
Thank you. We take the question back there also.
Maria Björkman. I suppose that a hallmark for the Soviet Union fight of war during the Second World War wasn't really respect of the law of war, and I don't know whether we're going from bad to worse or if it's pretty much the same. So my question is not related specifically to Ukraine, but if, God forbid, the war would spread in Europe, how can countries, European countries, then prepare for a war with an aggressor who's never shown any respect for the law of war? What are the best advice that you can give?
Thank you. Let's start with Anders with your question.
Well, thank you, Hans, for that question. I skipped so much of the work we did in this group during the minutes that I had for my brief presentation. We also looked at what the Canadian, I think what we're referring to, the Canada has done. And Canada has enacted new laws that makes it easier for Canada, if I understand it correctly, to confiscate private assets that are held in Canada. There are European countries that are doing the same. I think Estonia is in this process as well, and some others. We looked at the private assets as well in my working party. In the working party I had the privilege to chair. And felt that since they were smaller, we should concentrate on the large chunk first. But there are also EU processes underway, EU legislative processes underway that would harmonize EU countries' ability and possibility to confiscate assets held by private persons that have committed a crime, and that's the key to do this. And also there is a process underway in sharpening how crime against sanctions should be used in this perspective. So this is my answer to your question, which I think is a very good one. It shows, I think, that this is new territory for many of us, and it's difficult to follow all the avenues and paths that are leading in different directions for different assets under different conditions. But I think we are moving forward.
Thank you, Anders. And does anyone want to comment? Yeah?
Yeah, I can try to answer that question. And let me answer in two ways. I think, first of all, one way of doing what you say is for Europe to really be extremely firm on rule of law and upholding the international rules-based order, and avoiding situations where we can be accused of double standards, for instance. So, to sort of strengthen the pursuit of justice and accountability globally, in a way. And then I think the second answer to that question is also ramping up support to Ukraine militarily, military assistance, so Ukraine can win the war. I think the West has been, helpful in terms of providing weapons and ammunition, but much too slow, much too reactive. So if you really want Ukraine to win, we need to ramp this up, because this is the best way of ensuring European security more globally, making sure that Ukraine can win.
Thank you. And Elsa, you will get the
Yeah, I just wanted
comment.
to add to what Fredrik just said, that other things on a more European level is the growing of the EU family. What is happening now when we say yes to Ukraine becoming a EU member, including them in the European family, together with Moldova and Georgia, and when we see a new energy for the countries in Western Balkans, that is also about preparing Europe, creating a stronger Europe. And I think we should not underestimate that as well. It's also a way of, I wouldn't say prepare, but creating a stronger Europe.
Yeah. Thank you, Elsa, and thank you to all of our speakers for your excellent presentations and your very interesting and thoughtful points in this discussion. And a special thank you to you, Miroslava Krasnoborova, for coming here and sharing your important work in addressing the need for continued support. And thank you to all of you that have been here at Europahuset and to all of you that have listened online. Thank you so much.